Thank you, Jeanette. Thanks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. And I see myself as a developmental and behavioral scientist. And I've been at La Trobe since 20 years now, since 1996 in January. And I was very privileged to be able to found the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Center, which we established in mid-2008. And our mission really within the center is to advance knowledge on the nature, causes, and treatment of autism spectrum conditions. Our research at OTARC really does span right across the life cycle, from focus on very early signs in infancy and early diagnosis, early intervention, and right through into adulthood, where we're very keen, for example, to facilitate employment in those people who have a diagnosis of autism. So when we started, the focus was very much on the early years, which is my core interest. But as we've gone on in the last 8 years, we've been able to attract researchers who have expertise right across the developmental span. Today, however, I will focus on the first 2 years of life, where I think as a society we can do some of our best work in really being able to change developmental outcomes for children and their families. And just a very brief introduction for those of you who don't know what autism is. It's now encompassed under the umbrella term of autism spectrum disorder, and these are really a set of neurodevelopmental conditions that affect between 1% to 2% of the population. And approximately 50% of people with autism have intellectual disability. Now, the onset of autism is variable across the first 2 years of life. So some children show signs right from birth, with parents saying, the minute I held him in my arms, I knew there was something wrong. Other children seem to develop typically and then just plateau. Their development doesn't proceed. And yet others seem to develop typically and regress. So they actually lose skills at around 18 months of age. Some children regress even later, and it seems that the later the regression, the more severe the symptoms. But we really don't understand these different patterns of development apart from the fact that they occur. So these early signs in the sort of infancy years are very subtle. But if you know about them, they can be used as markers to prospectively identify a child from developing autism. And we know that an early diagnosis can be stable. So there's every reason then why you want to identify and diagnose early, because it's established that good naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions can serve to change the developmental trajectory of autism and to limit the learning disability that so often accompanies these sets of conditions. The other thing we know is that parent and family stress is very high and quality of life is low, not just compared to typically developing families of typically developing children, but also families of children with other developmental disabilities. And we also know that early identification and diagnosis can serve to reduce stress and increase quality of life in these families. So one way of promoting positive outcomes for the child and the family is to really get in early, identify early, and diagnose early. So, as I said when I started, I've had a long interest in autism in the early years, even while I was quite young, when I was much younger. And I've been very lucky in being able to, I've lost a slide. I've been very lucky in being able to attract very good PhD students into my area of interest and into this program of work. So we know that despite early identification and diagnosis, the current age of diagnosis in Australia is 49 months. Now, these data were collected and worked on by one of our very bright young PhD students, Catherine Bent, and we got access to some service data under a federally funded program called the Helping Children with Autism package. So these were families across Australia, 15,000 families who accessed this package between 2010 and 2012. And these are just under 7-year-olds. So in fact, this is an underestimate of the age of diagnosis. And you'll see here that in Australia, it's 49 months. In Victoria, it's 50 months. And in fact, across Australia, less than 3% of children with autism have a diagnosis by 24 months of age. And less than 20% have a diagnosis by 30 months. And so this is what we want to change. And I think we can do this, and we are doing this through our research and service at La Trobe University. So together with a PhD student who is now a research fellow at our center, Dr. Josephine Barbaro, she's undertaken 2 large studies in Victoria over the last 10 years. The first of which was her PhD research. And the aim really was to prospectively identify infants who are at risk of autism through the maternal and child health system. And this was achieved by training maternal and child health nurses to recognize signs of autism in infants during their routine developmental checks in the 2nd year of life. And we focused on the ages of 12, 18, and 24 months. And infants deemed to be developing autism based on the signs that the nurses are trained on are then referred to us at La Trobe for further developmental and behavioral assessments. And we've got some of our team here who do some of this work. And the team then follows these children up at 6-monthly intervals till 24 months when the diagnostic decision is made at the 24-month assessment. So these are data from Josie's PhD. And so in this first study, the nurses monitored just over 20,000 infants with 1% of these infants referred to us. I've just lost my pointer. Oh, here we go. And so you can see about 50% of those families came to us. And of those families who came to us, Josie tested all of those children. And of those, gave us an estimated prevalence of 1 in 119. And the way this was, so this is estimated because the way this prevalence was ascertained was we assumed that if the 50% of children who didn't come to us, if 81% also had autism, then that would give us this estimated prevalence. And in this time, between 2006 and 2008, by 2008, the data from the Center for Disease Control was about 1% of children were affected with autism. So here we had a prevalence, estimated prevalence of 0.84, and we know that these diagnoses were stable. Now, these results have been published and have formed the basis of a replication study which we're undertaking within the Autism CRC, where La Trobe is an essential partner. And so Josie has been leading this study, and these are the results that we have to date. Nancy, our intake officer, knows every one of these families. And as you can see here, 2% this time are referred to us, and the majority of these families are coming around in comparison to the first study. And once again, as before, we have this positive predictive value of 81%. So 81% of children referred to us in the first and the second study have a diagnosis of autism by 2 years of age. Importantly, in both studies, the children who don't have autism have either a language or developmental delay, which means that they're identified as developing atypically earlier than would otherwise have been the case. But here in the second study, you'll see the estimated prevalence is much higher, and this again is in accord with the current CDC figures of 1 in 68 children having a diagnosis of autism. We've got 1 in 60 so far. I generally say that between 1 to 2% of people will have autism. So the SACS then really remains the most effective means of early identification to date, and we believe that this is because it relies on the training of professionals who repeatedly monitor children across the second year of life rather than a one-off screening at a single point in time. And this is important because, as I said to you, the onset of autism is variable across those first 2 years of life. So if you just go in at one time, you'll catch some children, but you'll miss others, which is why you need to go in repeatedly across that second year. So this is why developmental surveillance is strongly recommended over screening, and we really think that this models a new approach for early identification of autism. Now, in an effort to make Dr. Barbaro's work much more scalable, we paired up with the 4th largest IT company in the world, Salesforce, which is a CRM company, and they helped us to develop a free mobile app. They helped us to build this app, a free mobile app on the early signs that were used in the SACS study that Josie used to train maternal and child health nurses. And the app is designed, however, it can be used by professionals, but here we're putting the power in the parents' hands so that parents can monitor their children across the second year of life. So this is a self-guided tool where parents view videotapes of behaviors of interest and respond whether their child shows that behavior rarely or often, regularly. And then if the child comes up, so these are for each item, there's a video. Parents view a typically developing child showing that behavior and view that behavior or lack of it in a child with autism, and parents then rate their child as rarely or often showing that behavior. And the SACS algorithm then tells the parent immediately whether their child has a low or high likelihood of developing autism. And they're immediately sent an email where they're advised to print out the items, passed and failed, and to take the assessment to a medical practitioner for a formal assessment and diagnosis. So we've also built a website that supports the parent through the journey and tells them about what autism looks like early in life, what it might mean for them, and the next steps. For those families who don't have a high likelihood, they're reminded, the app reminds them automatically in 6 months to do the next assessment. And in this way, parents can track their child's development over that second year of life. Now, the app recently won the Victorian Eye Award for Research and Development, and last week we took out the National Award. So here is the team in the smaller figure winning the National Award, and the Victorian Award, and Josie with the National Award. Received at the Melbourne Convention Centre last Thursday. So very exciting. And Josie now is beginning a program of research on the app to make sure that the app has a high positive predictive value, just like the SACS approach with training nurses. And we also want to develop a professional version of the app called AS Detect Pro. Okay, now I want to tell you about the first cohort of children that were part of Josie's PhD and what's happened to them in follow-up. So we brought these children back. So at age 2, they had a diagnosis and they went off into the world, into the next steps of early intervention and so on. And we followed that original cohort at preschool age. And as you'll see here, there was high stability with 86% of these children maintaining their diagnosis at age 4. Now, together I told you about so much work being undertaken with very smart and motivated PhD students. So with a current PhD student, we've been following these children up till school age. And through school age, we're finding that children retain their diagnoses, but some also leave the spectrum. But most importantly, we know that these children are doing very well. So you will see from this slide and in this graph the cognitive outcomes of children, and at 24 months we have 64% of children who meet criteria for an intellectual disability, meaning the developmental quotient is less than 70. By school age, only 8 to 9% have an intellectual disability. So these children are making remarkable gains, and importantly, by school age, we have 27% who are no longer meeting criteria for a formal diagnosis of autism. That doesn't mean they're not autistic, but the severity of their symptoms are greatly reduced, and this is also likely with the increasing cognitive ability of this sample. So given we know that these young children are doing very well, we want to know whether they're doing better than children who are diagnosed after the age of 3. So Megan then collected a control sample and compared our children who were diagnosed by 2 to children diagnosed between 3 to 5 years of age, so diagnosed before school age. Now, as you can see here, firstly, children diagnosed of the children diagnosed early, more children are attending mainstream schools and fewer need ongoing support. And this is because those children who are identified and diagnosed early are able to access early intervention earlier, and consequently have more early intervention by the time they enroll in school. So these results really keep us committed to the work we're doing. Clearly, if we can get in early and begin intervening at the age where language is still developing, we can really impact on these children's cognitive development. So we're working within the Autism CRC to make sure that 50% of children with autism in Australia are diagnosed by 24 months. Currently, only 3% are, and that 70% are diagnosed by 36 months. Currently, only 20% are. So we do have a lot of work to do. So our model really does show a new approach on how to build capacity in primary healthcare staff to identify children developing autism and to refer them for early diagnosis. Now, we're currently working on a whole of Tasmania implementation within the Autism CRC, and we've also been working internationally since 2011. And indeed, the SACS is now incorporated as part of the Tianjin Women and Child Health Plan. So Tianjin is the 4th largest city in China, where 100,000 babies are born each year. In Australia, we have 300,000 babies born each year. And Tianjin is also the sister city to Melbourne. So we've been able to get this approach into the 7-year health plan there. But we're working across many countries, and indeed, our PhD student is here from Nepal, and we'll be implementing this in Nepal in October, beginning in October this year. The next step is also to translate the app so that it'll reach more of the world's population. Now, in enabling early identification, in enabling early intervention, not only has the opportunity to maximize developmental and educational gains, but also the ability to improve family functioning and well-being. And ultimately, this will, we hope, will reap long-term benefits for society. So from a rationalist perspective, early detection and subsequent early intervention serves to reduce the whole-of-life costs incurred not only by families but also by governments, because it costs $55,000 less per year to raise a child with autism without intellectual disability than raising a child with autism and intellectual disability. So there really is a climate of optimism now for better outcomes for these children, and the importance of public education about the early characteristics of autism and the value of early identification and intervention cannot be underestimated. All right, so the question is, how quickly did the doctors get on board with a very good? The app was launched on, so I can't actually answer that question because the app was launched on Valentine's Day this year. And within 6 months of being launched, we've had more than 10,000 downloads, 6,000 registrations of children, and 4,000 assessments undertaken. As I said, Josie is starting a program of research where we're going to be able to answer that question, but it's very early days yet. But the thing is that generally pediatricians and GPs say things like, oh, look, you can't diagnose autism till much later. And so we're hoping the app is not only, a way of identifying children early, but will also be an awareness-raising tool. So maybe next year I can answer your question.